Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about lessons we learned while trying to study a foreign language and how it can help you study for the bar exam. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Today we're chatting about 5 lessons we've learned while trying to study another language. And this is a pretty interesting topic to us because I recently spent 3 years living in Mexico City, where I tried somewhat successfully to learn Spanish. And Lee is currently learning French.
Yeah.
So we've kind of been talking about some of the strategies that I use that now Lee is trying out. And we actually realized a lot of these techniques might even apply as you study for the bar.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's interesting about doing anything new or anything challenging is that you really feel like your brain exercising. Mm-hmm. And as my brain was exercising, I was like, I bet this is what my students feel like.
Exactly.
They're trying to study something hard.
It gives you more sympathy.
Yeah. So the first lesson I thought we would talk about is like picking your program or your plan to study carefully. So when I started to decide to start studying French, my first step was how? Which is
right. I mean, I think that's the first question. You're like, okay, great. Where do I get this
information?
Where do I start?
And this is not really that different than what, bar takers have to do, because there are old standards in the language world like Rosetta Stone, and then, a flood of new apps that you can load on your iPhone and other online programs. So I really did kind of have to look at reviews and see the different teaching techniques that these different programs had. And so first, back in, we're recording this in February. This was back in last July. Okay. I purchased a program that really required me to sit at my computer and listen carefully to conversations and try and memorize them.
That doesn't sound like the most effective way of learning.
No,
but okay.
I literally did it 3 times and then I totally stopped because I found it was such a challenge to find time in my schedule to sit down, and everything had to be perfect in order for me to do any of this work. And so I basically stopped.
Yeah, I remember somewhere I have a whole set of CDs like from back in the day that I purchased, I think on Amazon or something, to try to learn Spanish. I think I got maybe an hour or 2 into the first CD.
I mean, it was really bad.
I found them the other day and I was like, oh, right. That was that whole guy who had that whole program about how to learn Spanish. Yeah. And probably had some good information in there.
I think I learned,
never listened to it.
I did the first lesson, and
I mean, how would I even play a CD now? If I wanted to, I'd have no idea.
You saw that the little CD player I have for my children that I think they broke finally on this vacation. It's been in my house for about 4 years.
Maybe I could have borrowed it. But yeah, point being, this was not really a form factor that was working.
No, and I also realized that lesson technique was really all audio.
Right,
you were
this
just
was
listening
as well.
to it. Yeah, and I need visual cues. We talk a lot about examining your learning style when we talk about studying for the bar, and it was really interesting to me, especially with a foreign language, of trying to hear these words that I couldn't sometimes even differentiate what the words were. And without any sort of visual cue, I was totally lost.
Yeah. No, I think that's, I started off, I think, in Mexico with Duolingo. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the things I liked about it, was they had parts where they would show you kind of what they were saying, and then you would also read it.
Yeah.
And you would also hear it.
I think Duolingo is an interesting one because I'm also using that now, because they really rotate through different learning styles. You have to listen and translate something. You have to read it. You have to write it. You have to do it multiple ways.
Right.
Which I do think is interesting because we all remember things differently.
Yeah, no, they're definitely all about the spaced repetition
too.
So there's definitely some learning theory going on.
There's some learning theory going on. But I thought that it was interesting that in the beginning, instead of just aborting and saying, this is not the right program for me, I just stopped. not necessarily the best.
Switching.
Rather than switching, I just kind of aborted and said, I don't have time to do this now.
Well,
which was wrong.
I'm going to guess you probably said to yourself at some point, I'm just bad at learning languages.
Oh, if it's possible.
I said that.
It's possible. I mean, I'll be honest. I've never been a whiz at learning languages. It's never been my thing. And so then I did kind of go through, like, maybe I should, I'm not going to be able to do this, or maybe it's too hard, or whatever.
Just not worth the effort.
Just not worth the effort, or it's just going to be,
You have Google Translate. Why bother?
Exactly. But then I took me a few months. So like I said, that was July. And now we're in February. But I had recommitted in the new year as one of the things that I wanted to work on, not a resolution, just a commitment. And started to kind of look at my different options. And I have found some things that work for me. So I think that one of the things that really spoke to me about this failure, because it really is a failure, like a false start, was that it does matter what path you go down to study. And if something's not working, it doesn't mean that you can't learn it. It just means that you need a different tool.
Right. And I think one of the reasons that both of us have probably found languages difficult in the past is that we are more visual learners.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think even, if I think back to like what I was doing in college, I studied French in high school, I studied Spanish in college. I didn't remember anything from either one of them. And partly that was, I think, because of the way that they were taught. They're taught in this very oral type of way, or they're just like, memorize these verbs out of context, that kind of thing. And I think a lot of language learning is not that great. But I think if you'd asked either one of us, we said, yeah, I'm pretty visual. And so you probably could have predicted, if you'd really thought about it, that what was going to work better for you was probably something that incorporated like more visual learning.
Yeah. And yeah. So I think that one of the things we want our listeners to take away from this is this idea that, before you decide to take on a learning project, and I think the bar exam is a learning project, that you want to really examine all your options. And if you can, try some of them out.
Yeah.
Because, we've talked about how you can try out different bar review programs, especially when you're studying for the MPRE. A lot of them give you free access to their MPRE materials. But you want to test it out, because just because it works for one person doesn't mean that it's going to work for another.
Right. And also to think about what's worked for you in the past. I think that's one of the bar places people fall apart. They think like, oh, I'll just sign up for, this program that everyone else in my school is signing up for, without really thinking about, is this the way that I learn?
Yeah, exactly. And you've got to be able to abort, but don't abort and stop like I did. Abort and and kind of try again.
Right.
Yeah.
Or, add something to it. Like all these programs have the information you need to pass. You might just need to access it in a different way.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. Because you found, I think, that you've moved on to not just like the one perfect program, right?
Right. So lesson number 2 for me was that sometimes the answer is more than one program. And so after my first failed attempt and a few months of just completely like leaving this on my list just to start my French lessons and not doing it, I needed to find something that was more flexible. And so I realized that what I really needed was something that could run on my phone. So I started looking at different apps. And then my cousin's husband was studying, made his New Year's resolution to study a foreign language and was posting on social media about it. And I was like, oh, I'd never heard about that app. Clearly, we had never discussed this. So
right.
We'd used Duolingo too.
Oh, that was Duolingo.
It was Duolingo,
yeah.
Which was like the first one that I downloaded. And then I realized like once I downloaded that one, I'm like going through my iPhone and I'm like, oh, and then like Rosetta Stone has an app and, you know, Drops has an app and all of this stuff. And so I just started downloading them
right.
and for free and trying them out. And I realized that what I really liked was to have a couple different things because they were each exercising my brain in a different way. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I have found that I've been using Rosetta Stone and Duolingo. That has been my favorite crossover because I think Duolingo is much more straightforward. Rosetta Stone is much more focused on, you know, speaking phrases. But there are parts of that program that frustrate me. There are parts of Duolingo that kind of frustrate me. And so mixing it up has kind of allowed me to fill in the gaps, and I can see, you know, there's going to be some crossover in the content, but I'm also just kind of seeing that I'm learning things kind of in a different way from each one. And I think if I just stuck to one, I may not be learning as quickly because then you're just kind of down this one rabbit hole and you're only getting this exposure, and this exercise is only working your brain in one way.
Yeah, I found for me, like I like Duolingo a lot in kind of like the first weeks that I was in Mexico, but then after a while it got kind of repetitive.
Yeah.
And, you know, like I'm a person who's good at taking tests. And so ultimately, like, what they were giving me was just kind of test taking in a way.
It's so true. That's one of the things that I didn't.
So like the multiple choice or like fill in the blank or whatever. I'm like, oh, I know this answer. Like I might not actually even know like what the word meant or anything. I just knew the answer because I've seen it before.
Or that I knew the context of the answer. And so I'd be like, I bet this is, I study in New York, you know?
Yeah, no, this actually got me the first, I tried to sign up for a class when I first got there at the International House, and they gave me an online testing program to kind of see where I should be. Mm-hmm. And I'm good at tests. Like I could do them in any language, you know? And so, I mean, I told them this, you know, I did the multiple choice, which is a really weird way to test languages.
Yeah.
You know, so I did that. And then I, you know, emailed the organizer. I'm like, I really think that this probably overestimated my ability level because like I'm a good test taker. And she's like, oh, no, like that doesn't happen. So then I show up and they put me in this class. It's like way too advanced. I don't know anything. Like I've never studied. I don't remember any of the past tense. Like I don't remember numbers. And they're like, you don't know anything. I'm like, I told you this.
Yeah.
Like I told you I was just good at multiple choice.
Mm-hmm. And then I thought it was also interesting because I was also using Rosetta Stone, which doesn't translate anything for you. That's their big thing. It's like an immersion type situation.
Right.
And in French, one of the things that I learned is that the word for white, you know, it depends on the gender of the noun. It's two different words, complete.
Oh, really?
Different adjectives.
They're not just like different endings?
No.
You can tell I don't remember much French.
Well, yeah. So, but what it was interesting is that Rosetta Stone doesn't tell you that. You're just supposed to figure it out. And then because I'm an impatient person, I finally was like, I cannot do this anymore. And I had to Google like why you use different ones. And then once I got this explanation, now I never got it wrong again because I just learned the explanation that it was about the gender of the thing that you were describing. And so I also found that even though I'd picked my tools that I liked, I still needed to feed my own curiosity to solve my own problems, because when it all came down to it, just because they decided that this immersion, you know, no explanation way is the best way to learn. Like for my brain, I was just literally getting so frustrated that I couldn't completely figure out why I was getting it wrong, that I was going cuckoo. So I just needed to like step back, get my questions answered, and then regroup.
Yeah, the immersion thing can be tricky. I remember my very first Spanish class in college was full on like immersion, and the guy comes in, our teacher, and he says, oh, me llamo Yosef. And we're like, okay. So everyone kind of understood he was saying, like, my name is something. But, like, we all thought he was saying my name is myself, or, like, I am myself or something. And so he's asking people, like, what our names are. And we're all saying, like, me llamo Yosef. And he's like, no. And it was like, he was getting really frustrated. But it was like, this is day one. We have no idea. And he has this, like, name that sounds like myself, you know, in English. Yeah, that semester didn't go well.
Yeah, I think that... you really just have to be kind of open and curious. And I think that that is something that you also need to be apply to your bar study. I think that there are so many points where you can get frustrated, you know, that you can say, oh, I don't understand how this law applies. And then you just keep reading the same thing over and over again, thinking that someday it's going to click, when maybe you need to like step away and find another example so you can appreciate what it is and move on.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, you know, I ended up using kind of Duolingo, and that was great for certain things. And then I also, in the house I was staying in, found this great book about Spanish verbs that like laid everything out very, very clearly. So I would use the verb book. And then, of course, I hired a tutor because the class didn't work out at all, since I was totally not at the right level. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, you can think about it for bar prep too. Like you might need different pieces for different different parts of this puzzle.
Right.
You know, like you've got to know the law, but you've also got to practice, and you've got to get like tracking, you know, so you might want something like Adaptabar to help you track your MBE progress. You might want like a smart bar outline that's shorter in addition to whatever huge amount of, you know, telephone book size book you've got. With some other program, you know, maybe videos work for you sort of, but you also need to reinforce it with something else.
Right.
And that's totally fine.
Right. And then sometimes you might learn the lesson that I did, which is that maybe you also need to have some sort of a tool, whether it be flashcards or Adaptabar or something that will run off your phone, because maybe you need to be able to study in different situations. So really the key to my ability to study French was realizing that while I am pumping milk for my baby, that I could learn French on my phone.
That's great multitasking.
I do. And I pump like almost 90 minutes a day.
Yeah, that's great.
So one of those, I do watch the Great British Baking Show because it's late at night, and like I can't really learn anything late at night.
Well, but you could also start watching shows in French.
Oh, that's true. I have also thought about doing that.
Even with English subtitles, I think it's helpful.
That's true, just to like get it kind of into your brain.
I mean, Netflix is making a lot. I don't know if they make French content. They're making a lot of Spanish language content now that's really great. I even watch, in fact, Nailed It I think Nailed It has a French version, possibly.
Oh.
They definitely have 2 Spanish versions, one in Mexico and one in Spain.
Oh, well, then I should check that out.
Yeah.
See what I'm learning here on this podcast? But, looking for these different ways that you can kind of fold the bar study into your day-to-day life, I think can be refreshing too, because so many people get burned out just trying to sit and study and think that's the only way that they can study.
Yeah, I think something like sketchy law, which we've talked about before, if you're wanted to have something to do that, kind of background-ish, but that you can also just sort of sit and watch. I think that's a good one for when your brain's not totally, you're like 80% capacity.
Right.
But you could still do something.
It's true. All right. One of the things you mentioned, which was the next lesson, was that nothing can really replace working with a one-on-one tutor or having a teacher.
I think that's, certainly for language learning, I think that's true. You have to be able to talk to someone.
Right.
But yeah, even today, actually, I still talk with my tutor on Skype. And so we had a call today. And in fact, we were chit-chatting. It's been a week or two since we'd spoken. And then suddenly he switches and says, okay, we're going to do an exercise on the future imperfect. And he gets about a minute into it. And I'm like, I don't remember any of this. I don't remember the non-irregular future. You're giving me irregular future. I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't remember any of this. I've never used this verb tense in normal conversation. I don't even know why we're doing this. And so then he went into visual learning mode and turned the camera around and went to his whiteboard and kind of diagram for me, all right, these are the basics, this is not that hard, and we went through some exercises and practiced, and then he gave me the irregular ones, and then I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this is all sort of coming back to me, but I think if I'd just been in a class, I would have just been lost.
Right. And then you're just checked out. Typically.
And then I'd be like, okay, I guess I'll have to look this up later.
Right.
I don't really know what we're even talking about right now.
Yeah. And I think that the other thing that can be interesting is that a tutor can really also focus on your own individual struggles. So let's say that you have very specific pronunciation issues, or you're having trouble hearing things, or I think in the law school context, it can be this is law that you never studied in law school, and you could need, more of a context, or that you have specific writing struggles that someone else doesn't have, or what if English is not your first language and you're struggling with kind of the basics of legal writing in English that is very specific to you. All of that is going to be easier if you have somebody who can dive in and solve problems with you. Right.
And also someone who's really that expert.
Yeah.
And who can realize when you're totally floundering you. Because he's just going through this. Someone, I'm like, I do not know what you're talking about. He's like, okay, let's back up. Let's go back to basics here.
Yeah.
And you do need that because everybody has things that they're less comfortable with.
Sure. And there's an accountability element too, because you've talked about since you've come home,
which has been a year. So obviously my Spanish has gotten way worse.
Right. That if you didn't talk to your Spanish tutor,
it would be gone. Basically,
you and I aren't speaking in Spanish. My Spanish is pretty terrible. So
yeah. Granted, I could go in my neighborhood and I do actually hear a lot of Spanish spoken, but I'm not communicating with people on the street. I'm just eavesdropping.
Right. Which is definitely different.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, setting up some sort of accountability is making it easier for you to keep any of your skills up.
Right. We basically have a standing call twice a week. And granted, we don't do that call every single day. Or on Thursday, I'm like, oh, I have to cut it short by half an hour because I have this other thing that I had to schedule then.
Yeah.
But if I didn't have that on my calendar, I would never do it.
Yeah. So it allows for accountability, which I think is important.
Yeah.
So one of the things we mentioned earlier in the podcast that I think is important to bring up again is this idea with learning a language, which is the same thing with bar prep, is you have to play a long game because you are going to get discouraged. And I think for people who consider themselves fairly smart and good at learning things, anytime you learn something and challenge yourself, and it's going to be hard, it's not going to happen overnight, and you have to be okay with that.
Oh, yeah. No, that for me, I think was the most frustrating part of trying to learn Spanish, because I did think, I had a very fixed mindset around just, I'm not good at learning languages. I took Spanish in college. I don't remember anything. I took French in high school. I don't remember anything. It's not true. I remember some, but not much. So, I thought, I'm moving to Mexico in a couple of months. I'm sure I'll be fluent. And I lived there 3 months, and I, at that point, had tried out a language school that didn't work, and I had found a tutor who didn't work, and then I had done Duolingo, and I'd found this book. But, I really had not made a ton of progress. And there was that realization of this is not a couple of week-long project.
Right. And I've had friends who are expats who've lived various different places and who've immersed themselves into different languages that are it's a long game, and then someday it clicks. And I remember even being abroad in college in Spain, and speaking Spanish more there than I had ever spoken before. And there was a point where you realize that you're just thinking in Spanish, which was totally different than translating everything and thinking through how you were going to say something. But it was like, it was a process to get there. I wouldn't say that I was fluent. I could just, I had, the appropriate skills to move my 20-something self through Spain and order drinks and dance at a disco and
tell people where you were from.
Tell people where I was from and give people directions on the metro, it was, but still even getting there was its own marathon. And I think any time that you consider yourself to be pretty good at stuff, you have to be able to kind of check your mindset and say, okay, this is frustrating. And instead of just throwing up your hands and saying this is dumb, I'm not going to ever be able to do it again, then you can say, no, I'm going to just keep doing it until I get it right.
Yeah, I think it is one of those things where you just kind of have to bang your head against the wall until suddenly your brain's like, oh, I remember what this term means.
Yeah.
And also, the more, the closer to immersion you can get in any of these things, I think the better. So, sometimes I've seen people put up Post-it notes all over their house with the words of things so that you're seeing them over and over. And people can definitely do things like that for the bar, put up your study materials and you're just going to start absorbing them by osmosis. I mean, one of the things I finally did that I think helped my comprehension a lot, just of literally comprehending the words, was I only listened to Spanish music in the background all day long.
Interesting.
So even though I didn't necessarily understand, I mean, even now, if I listen to these same songs, I'm not I can't translate it in real time. But I think it really, really helped just to have my brain working on that in the background all the time.
Yeah, and just to get comfortable with the sounds and comfortable with the way that the phrases string together. And
or just I could at least be I don't know what that word means, but I understand that is a word, in a way that when I first arrived, it was just kind of this blah, 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 and then suddenly you start to piece out words and phrases and then it's okay, I understood most of that sentence, but even now, my tutor says things, I'm what was that? This morning he was talking about someone's baptism, for instance. And I was just
you didn't have a lot of context for that.
Yeah, it was what in the world? He's gesturing, and finally I'm oh, you're pouring the water over the babies. Oh, that's what that word is. Okay.
And that was then the last lesson that I wanted to raise, was that you don't only have to think about studying at your desk. And I think that, your point about the Post-its, my point about being able to do Duolingo while I am pumping breast milk, or if you have flashcards on your phone, or if you're waiting to pick up your kid and you always wait for 15 minutes, you can add 15 minutes throughout the day. I think that you can gain a lot of knowledge by asking your brain to recall this information throughout the day. We spend a lot of time on this podcast and on our Law School Toolbox podcast talking about deep work, which I think is so critically important. However, it's not the only type of studying that you can do. And sometimes, getting that repetition and that spaced repetition for your brain is very powerful to do throughout the day.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to do the deep work to kind of understand the stuff to begin with. But at some point, you do really just literally have to memorize all of this. So, you're okay, great, I understand crim law. Now you need to memorize in order all of the different elements of homicide and the associated things with that. You just need to see that a lot. So, yeah, you could have a flashcard that, you're standing in line at the coffee shop and you quiz yourself on that. 5 to 10 minutes. That's great. Do that a few times a day. And hey, you just studied an hour.
Right. Memorizing your mnemonics, it can be all that stuff. So I did a little math. And if you add 15 minutes a day of studying for 7 days a week for 8 weeks, you would add an extra 14 hours of studying for the bar exam. That's pretty significant. That's a couple of days of good solid study. And, if you did 30 minutes a day, that's 28 hours. That's more than many part-time studiers are even studying in a week. So you could almost add another whole week of studying by just adding 30 minutes a day that you're collecting from other places. And I think when we all get our screen use alerts from our phone, reminding us how much time we're spending looking at things like Instagram, I have personally found that using my downtime to study French is making me a happier person than spending it on social media or reading the news.
Oh, I have absolutely no doubt that is true.
So, maybe one way to protect you from what's happening in the world is to just spend your free time studying the bar exam instead.
Yeah, and you can kind of gamify it. And I think a lot of these language apps do this. They kind of gamify it for you and you've done 2 study sessions today. You've got one more to meet your goal. you can make your own little like Google Docs spreadsheet and check off your boxes every day. You're like, okay, I'm going to do 2 15-minute sessions of reviewing flashcards or whatever it is. I don't really care. Do something.
Right.
And you can really track that and give yourself a little reward. Like, oh, you did everything you were supposed to do this week. Yay, you get to get a manicure.
Right.
I think whatever men do, that's the equivalent.
I think that it is important to just think about how we can collect this extra time in a world where we feel like we're running out of time. I'm seeing more and more in my own life that yes, we don't have a lot of time, but boy, we are wasting a ton of time.
Oh yeah, I read a whole book yesterday. I mean, granted, it wasn't like the world's deepest book, and I did skim parts of it, but it was like 250 pages.
Yeah.
I got it from my mailbox at like noon yesterday, and I basically read all I wanted to read of it by about 10 p.m.
Yeah.
Because I just didn't go on Instagram that day.
I know, it really is amazing. And how much energy and emotional energy we expend, on things like social media. It's something to really think about, I think, when you look at something like studying for the bar, of how you want to focus your efforts.
Yeah, and I think some of what we do, a lot of what we do is just kind of avoiding boredom. So it's like, oh, I'm like waiting for my coffee. I'll scroll through some social media app. But you could just set your life up so that you scroll through Adaptabar for 5 minutes. Like, that's totally your choice.
Yeah. And, and like I said, just 30 minutes a day, where I think if most of us looked at our days, we could find 30 minutes that we waste doing something. That could be almost an extra week of studying for most people.
Well, and also I think the critical part is you could be doing memorization then. And so, a lot of people just say like it's so hard to memorize things. And then you realize when you talk to them in more depth, they waited until like 2 weeks before the exam and then sat down and tried to start memorizing.
Yeah.
That doesn't really work that well. Like seeing stuff over and over is what gets it into your memory. So even if you are spending those 30 minutes a day looking at flashcards and things like that, like start that 8 to 10 weeks early, and it's going to be way easier than if you start that the week before.
Yeah. So, good life lesson. Always keep learning, but you got to mix it up. You can't just sign up for one thing and decide that that's the way you're going to do it. And then if it doesn't work for you, decide that you can never learn French.
Right. Because I think pretty much anyone can learn a language. It just takes a lot of time and effort.
Yeah. And some people are going to be better at it than others, but that doesn't mean that you can't do it.
Right. I mean, that's the same as the bar. Like some people are better at certain parts of the test and they might pass more easily. That doesn't mean you can't pass. It just means you're going to have to do more work.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, any final thoughts after your 3 years of studying Spanish?
Well, I mean, my Spanish is still not perfect, but your knowledge on the bar exam will also probably not be perfect. And that is totally fine. And I can still communicate in most scenarios and you can still pass the exam.
Yep. All right. Well, with that, we are out of time. I want to take a second to remind you to check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam. You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to help support you as you study for the UBE or California bar exam. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you're still in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Alison or myself at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or allison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.